Well, I'd like to welcome you to this lecture. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the night sky. It's of course a fascinating subject that humanity's been studying for a long time, and we now have, all kinds of high-tech equipment to study it, the Hubble Space Telescope and radio astronomy and so on. And while that science is fascinating, and I do try to keep up with it, these lectures are really geared towards somebody in the field and what does a particular situation mean to me in the field. And so we're going to cover the night sky in that manner. What does it mean to a person out in the desert? What does the night sky really mean? Is it just there, just dark, and that's it? Of course, the night sky really is much more than that, and sometimes I think it's underappreciated. And when I mean the night sky, I mean the natural night sky, no telescopes, nothing like that. And that night sky, no matter where our ancestry came from, was part of our culture, part of our psychology, part of what we are. It's amazing the effect that the night sky has had on humanity when you really start looking at it. We were looking at the night sky, our ancestors were, long before they had fire, stone tools, and so on. It was something that we wondered at. It was unreachable. Some parts of it were unpredictable, other parts were very predictable. And this gets back to that idea of our natural knowledge. That is, the knowledge, and that's something that we learn. But natural meaning that our mind is designed, you might say, to accept it, that it was part of it. The two mingle and fit together perfectly. But the knowledge is learned. And this knowledge we still have to learn to this day. However, many people living under electric lights never really learn this. They don't live under a natural sky. The stars are usually obliterated, and even such things as the moon that does shine through city lights is discounted. The street lamps are have a higher level of brightness and whatnot, and certainly certain billboards and stuff are something built to get our attention, and so the moon is just lost in this array of lights. So we don't even really learn the cycles of the moon. And of course, the night sky is virtually half our existence. We live under the night sky as much as we live under the daylight, under the sun. Now, we are creatures of the daylight primarily, and so we're up during the day and we tend to sleep at night. But still, the night sky is part of who and what we are. And for that reason, it's really important, if you want to get into a more natural understanding of the world, natural understanding of ourselves, you need to learn a little bit about the night sky. You should be able to see the Milky Way and understand it and find it. You should be able to find Venus, Mars, Jupiter, especially Jupiter and Venus. Mars is a little harder. Mercury is a little harder. But Venus and Jupiter, you should be able to spot, understand, and know them kind of as an old friend. As well as understanding the moon cycles, not just its monthly waxing and waning, but the fact that it shows up later every day. And just some of the variations in the night sky. You should have some understanding of the yearly cycle of the constellations. Many people, still to this day, they'll go out camping and they know the constellations that they're going to see, because they say, well, we go out in October and this is what we're going to see. Or we go out in the summertime and these are some of the summertime constellations. And with that, you'll start to understand a more natural cycle of time. We still have the daylight, that's a natural cycle of time. But there were others, and people used to mark these kind of things as part of their life. And I think we still should. The night sky is also a useful thing once you start to understand and have that natural knowledge. It certainly will give you directions. Another thing you should be able to point out is the North Star. You should be able to point out the North Star. But just the placement of the moon and the constellations will tell you your directions. It will tell you north, south, east, west. You really can't mistake them. Once you know the night sky, you can always get your directions from it. Of course, unless you're in a cloudy situation. Now, another thing that the night sky is part of our culture and part of what we do and who and what we are is, again, you can predict the future, which is part of being a human. The night sky, you can predict the future with it. And while this might sound like I'm going to drift off into astrology or something, I assure you I'm not a follower of astrology. But you can understand where that concept arrived from once you start using the night sky. Anybody who's ever woken up, especially if you're sleeping out in the desert without a tent, you can wake up in the middle of the night and look and say, well, it's the middle of the night, or another hour or so the sun will start to shine, or really it's very early in the evening, just by looking at the placement of the constellations. You look at them, you can say, okay, there's Orion, and Orion's high or low, and I went to bed, it was on the horizon. Maybe it was on the eastern horizon when you went to bed, and now it's in the middle of the sky. You have an idea of where you are in the night, time-wise. And you can actually predict and say when Orion gets to this position, the sun will start to come up. And it'll be just something you can understand. And of course you can, a really easy one to understand, but it's part of the sky, is you start to see the eastern sky light up, or if you see Venus, and you say, well, there's Venus, the sun's not far from coming up. And so you start to learn to predict the evening. And then of course, if you understand the cycle of the constellations, and they go through a yearly cycle on what's visible, you can say, you know, that's the first star of Orion, and that's where we are in a certain month, in a certain place. And you start to understand and predict where you are in the yearly cycle by the placement of the constellations. And that's the kind of predictive quality that the night sky has. And of course the moon is the same way. The moon is another one that's very easy. As it waxes and wanes through its cycle, you can look at it and say, well, the moon's getting smaller and smaller, and this is what's going to happen. And it gives you that ability to predict. And in ancient times, especially with hunter-gatherers, the waxing and waning of the moon was an important thing. The brightness of the full moon makes a real difference with what's out there in the dark and what it can do, because suddenly you have a vision component that's growing in the night that wasn't there 10, 15 days ago. And animals like bears or mountain lions and stuff like that are going to utilize that. And so, of course, are the other animals, and you get into this predator-prey shifting back and forth, and there's no solid answer. A lot of people have often tried to get some sort of solid answer where deer do this under a full moon, or mountain lions will do this when it's perfectly dark. But it's never perfectly dark. The stars actually emit quite a bit of light, for some animals anyway, that are better suited toward night vision. And with that, you can understand that the color scheme of the ground, whether you have a gallery forest, for instance, where the trees are overhanging and they got full leaves, even under a full moon can be very dark. And where the light comes through, it has kind of a dappled effect, which tends to break up the outline of some creatures. And then you can have things like a meadow. The grass, if it's a dark green, can actually absorb a lot of light. It can be relatively dark. And then suddenly throughout the night, you get a frost condition and it changes. That frost has a high level of reflectivity, and an animal moving across the meadow now shows up really well. And even they'll leave a track that's visible. So the moon changes the game quite a bit, and you can only really understand that by spending time out at night beyond the reach of artificial light. And so once we start to look at all these different things that the night sky really does, and it's part of the environment, and it's part of who and what we are, part of humanity, and every aspect of our being was partly attached to the night sky. Our whole idea of hunting and gathering, that we used our minds to predict and intersect the future, whether it was to intersect a deer at a certain game trail, or to literally intersect an area of berries. You know, we might have said in our hunter-gatherer past, somebody might have went out and said, yes, the berries patch has a lot of flowers this year, so in a month or two from now, we need to go there to collect berries because it's going to be a good berry crop. Better than maybe going down to the lake and fishing. These are the kind of things that we used to do as human beings. Still do it in a modern sense, but in the natural knowledge, in the natural way of thinking, we need to have the night sky as part of who we are to be essentially who we are. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this lecture on the night sky, and might take a little time to ponder it, and actually, when you go on a camping trip or an outing, that you actually think about the night sky. It's actually worth making a whole trip. You could actually make a whole camping trip to a place that maybe it has a high elevation, get above a lot of the atmosphere, and in a dark area, just to experience and see the night sky. Especially if you look at it with the use of a modern calendar that has the moon cycles. A lot of times it's really interesting to do this when there is no moon, and experience the night sky without the moon. And then other times you might want to look and see, well, if we're going to have a full moon, we might change where we camp in accordance to the full moon. And these are just many things that you can kind of look at and start to learn and have some fun with the night sky. And I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and we'll be seeing you. Thank you very much.